The diplomatic station known as Concordia Prime floated in neutral space, far from any empire's borders. And today it would host the most important negotiations in human history. Lieutenant Claire Dawson stood perfectly still beside the airlock, her hands resting on the twin blades at her hips. And she watched the Vorok shuttle approach through the observation window. She was small by any species standards, standing only 5 feet and 2 inches tall. But her eyes held the calm focus of someone who had trained for combat since childhood. Ambassador Kevin Marshall adjusted his formal uniform beside her and cleared his throat nervously. "Remember, Lieutenant, we are here for peace," he said quietly. "No matter what they say or do, we cannot be the ones to start a conflict." Claire nodded once without taking her eyes from the approaching vessel. "Understood, Ambassador," she replied. "I am here to protect you, not to cause an incident." The shuttle docked with a heavy thud that echoed through the station's hull, and Claire felt her muscles tense automatically before she forced herself to relax. Commander Derek Holt stepped forward from behind them, his gray hair and weathered face showing decades of military service. He had trained Claire himself years ago, and he trusted her more than any other soldier under his command. "The Vorok delegation is larger than expected," he murmured, checking his datapad. 20 soldiers plus their general and support staff. The airlock hissed open, and Claire saw her first Vorok in person. They were massive creatures, each one standing between 8 and 9 feet tall, with bodies covered in thick armored scales that ranged from dark green to almost black. Their eyes were yellow with vertical slits, and their faces looked like something between a lizard and a wolf. Heavy ceremonial armor covered their chests and shoulders, and each soldier carried weapons that looked large enough to crush a human with a single blow. But it was the one in the center who drew Claire's attention. General Thrax Voron stood taller than the rest, easily 9 feet of muscle and scale, and barely contained aggression. His armor was decorated with the bones and teeth of creatures Claire could not identify, and his eyes swept across the human delegation with obvious contempt. He stopped walking when he saw Claire, and his mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile on a less terrifying face. "What is this?" he asked, his voice deep and rumbling like distant thunder. "Do the humans send children to guard their leaders now?" His soldiers laughed, a harsh barking sound that echoed through the docking bay. Claire said nothing and kept her expression completely neutral. General Voron stepped closer, towering over her like a mountain of scales and malice. "Look at this tiny creature," he said to his soldiers. "She barely reaches my chest, and she carries those little sticks at her sides like they could actually hurt something." He leaned down until his face was only a foot from hers, and she could smell his breath, hot and rank like rotting meat. "Tell me, little human, do you truly believe you could protect anyone from me?" Claire met his yellow eyes without flinching. "I believe I am here to ensure these negotiations proceed peacefully, General," she said calmly. "Nothing more and nothing less." Voron laughed again and straightened to his full height. "Peaceful," he repeated with mockery dripping from every syllable. "Yes. Let us talk of peace while my fleet waits just beyond your pathetic border defenses." Ambassador Marshall stepped forward with a diplomatic smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "General Voron, welcome to Concordia Prime," he said smoothly. "We have prepared quarters for your delegation, and the council chamber is ready whenever you wish to begin discussions." Voron waved one massive clawed hand dismissively. "Lead on then, human," he growled. "Let us get this theater performance over with quickly so I can return to matters of actual importance." The group moved through the station's corridors, and Claire walked 2 steps behind the ambassador. With her senses on high alert, she noticed everything around her, from the way the Vorok soldiers kept their hands near their weapons to the slight nervousness in the other alien delegations they passed. Concordia Prime hosted representatives from dozens of species, and many of them watched the Vorok with obvious fear. The Council chamber was a vast circular room with seats arranged in tiers around a central speaking platform. Representatives from 12 major galactic powers were already present, including the insectoid Chelrics, the aquatic Mondari in their water-filled suits, and the tall, thin Eloari who communicated through color changes in their translucent skin. General Voron took his place at the Vorak delegation seats and immediately began speaking before anyone could officially open the proceedings. "Let me save everyone time," he announced loudly. "The Vorak Empire has no interest in these negotiations, and we are only here because the Council threatened trade sanctions if we refused. Ambassador Marshall stood at the human delegation's position and spoke calmly despite the hostile opening. "General, the border conflicts of the past 3 years have cost thousands of lives on both sides," he said. "Surely there is room for discussion about reducing tensions and establishing clearer boundaries." Voron slammed his fist on the armrest of his chair, hard enough to crack the material. "The only discussion I am interested in is when humanity will accept its inevitable conquest," he snarled. "Your species is weak, small, and soft, and you have no place among the true powers of this galaxy." He pointed directly at Claire, who stood motionless behind the ambassador. "Look at your protector," he continued with cruel amusement. "A tiny female with primitive weapons, and this is the best humanity can offer." Claire remained silent and still, though she filed away every word and every gesture for later analysis. The first day of negotiations continued badly, with Voron interrupting constantly and dismissing every proposal the humans offered. By the time the session ended, Ambassador Marshall looked exhausted, and Commander Holt's jaw was tight with suppressed anger. Claire simply watched and waited that evening. She walked the corridors of Concordia Prime alone, memorizing every path and every potential ambush point. She noticed that several Vorak soldiers were doing the same thing, studying the station's layout with too much interest for a simple diplomatic visit. Something was wrong here, and Claire could feel it in her bones. She paused near a maintenance junction and activated her personal scanner, sweeping for any unusual signals or transmissions. What she found made her blood run cold. Encrypted communications were flowing between the Vorak quarters and an unknown location outside the station. And though she could not read the contents, the pattern suggested careful planning and coordination. It was not a diplomatic mission. This was the preparation for something far more dangerous. And Claire knew she had to find out what before it was too late. Claire moved quickly through the station's corridors until she reached Commander Holt's quarters, and she pressed the door chime with a sense of urgent purpose. The door slid open to reveal the commander still in his uniform, and his expression shifted from tired to alert the moment he saw her face. "Lieutenant, what is it?" he asked, stepping aside to let her enter. Claire walked in and activated the room's privacy field before speaking. "Commander, I intercepted encrypted transmissions from the Vorak quarters," she said quietly. "The pattern suggests coordination for some kind of operation, not diplomatic communication." Holt's eyes narrowed as he processed her words. "Are you certain?" he asked. "I am," Claire replied. "They've been studying the station layout all day, and their soldiers are positioning themselves near key access points throughout Concordia Prime." The commander ran a hand through his gray hair and exhaled heavily. "Even if you're right, we cannot accuse them without solid proof," he said grimly. "The Council is already divided on humanity's presence in this sector, and an unfounded accusation against the Vorak could push neutral parties against us." Claire nodded because she understood the political reality even if she hated it. "Then, I will find proof," she said. Simply. Holt looked at her for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Be careful, Lieutenant," he warned. "If the Vorak catch you investigating them, they will call it espionage and use it as an excuse to end negotiations entirely." Claire left his quarters and spent the rest of the night cycle moving through the station like a ghost. Watching and listening from the shadows, the second day of negotiations began with General Voran in an even fouler mood than before. He dismissed human proposals without even pretending to consider them. And he took every opportunity to mock Claire's presence. "I see your pet guardian is still here," he announced loudly as Ambassador Marshall entered the council chamber. "Tell me, Ambassador, does she do tricks or is she simply decorative?" His soldiers laughed their harsh barking laughs, and several representatives from other species looked uncomfortable at the open. Hostility. Claire stood behind the ambassador and let the words wash over her like water against stone. She had faced worse insults during her training years ago, and words from an arrogant alien would not shake her focus, but she noticed something interesting during the morning session. One of the Varak translators, a female named Kira Voss, who stood near the back of their delegation, kept glancing at Claire with an expression that looked almost like sympathy when General Voran made a particularly vicious comment about human weakness. Kira's jaw tightened with what appeared to be suppressed disgust. Claire filed this observation away and continued watching. During a break in the proceedings, Voran approached Ambassador Marshall with a predatory smile. "I have a proposal," the general said loudly enough for nearby delegates to hear. "Let us settle this matter the old way, with a test of strength between our peoples." Marshall frowned cautiously. "What kind of test?" he asked. Voran gestured toward Claire with one massive clawed hand. "A sparring match," he said. "Your little guardian against one of my soldiers, and we will see once and for all which species deserves respect in this galaxy." The chamber fell silent as everyone waited for the ambassador's response. Claire felt her muscles tense with readiness, and she was prepared to accept the challenge if ordered, but Marshall shook his head firmly. "We are here for diplomatic solutions, General, not physical contests," he said calmly. "I must respectfully decline." Voran's smile widened as if he had expected this answer. "Of course you decline," he said with contempt, "because you know your tiny warrior would be crushed in seconds. And then all of these witnesses would see humanity's true weakness." He turned and walked back to his delegation, while his soldiers snickered and whispered among themselves. The rest of the day passed with more insults and more failed negotiations, and by evening, Claire could see the frustration building in Ambassador Marshall's eyes. She excused herself early and made her way to a secluded observation deck on the station's outer ring. The stars stretched endlessly before her, and she used the quiet moment to clear her mind and focus her thoughts. She heard footsteps approaching from behind and turned to see Kira Voss, the Vorak translator, walking toward her alone. Claire's hands moved instinctively toward her blades, but she stopped when she saw the fear and desperation in Kira's yellow eyes. "Please," Kira said quietly, her voice carrying a heavy accent but clear enough to understand. "I need to speak with you, and I do not have much time." Claire studied her for a moment before nodding once. "Speak." "Then," she said. Kira glanced around nervously before moving closer and lowering her voice. "General, Voran is planning something terrible," she whispered. "Tonight his assassins will kill your ambassador and make it look like the Drelix Syndicate was responsible." Claire felt cold fury building in her chest, but she kept her voice steady. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Kira's scales shifted color slightly, a sign of emotional distress in Vorak physiology. "Because many of us are tired of endless war," she said. "Voran and his faction hold power through fear and conquest. But there are those among my people who want peace." She reached out and gripped Claire's arm with surprising gentleness. "If Voran succeeds tonight, war will begin immediately," Kira continued urgently. "Millions will die, both Vorak and human, and the killing will not stop until one side is completely destroyed." Claire processed this information rapidly. calculating options and risks. "Why should I trust you?" she asked bluntly. Kira released her arm and stepped back. "You should not trust me completely," she admitted. "But ask yourself this question. And what do I gain by warning you if this is a trap?" It was a fair point, and Claire nodded slowly. "How many assassins?" she asked. "3," Kira replied. "Elite soldiers from Voron's personal guard. And they will strike during the deep night cycle when station security is minimal." Claire looked out at the stars and made her decision in that moment. "Thank you," she said quietly. Kira turned to leave, but paused and looked back. "One more thing," she said. "If you survive this night and Voron demands retribution, do not let them take you alive, because the general's punishments are worse than death." Then she was gone, disappearing into the station's corridors like a shadow. Claire stood alone with the weight of what she had learned pressing down on her shoulders. She could go to Commander Holt, but there was no time to gather proof or convince the council she could alert station security. But the Vorak might have already compromised some of them, or she could handle this herself. Alone in the darkness with only her blades and her training, if she failed, she would be dead, and humanity would be blamed for starting a war if she succeeded but was discovered. She would be labeled a murderer and a war criminal. But if she did nothing, Ambassador Marshall would die and war would come anyway. Claire drew a slow breath and released it just as slowly. Then she walked toward her quarters to prepare for the night ahead, because her decision was already made. The deep night cycle fell over Concordia Prime like a heavy blanket, and the station's lights dimmed to their lowest, setting as most inhabitants retreated to their quarters for rest. Claire stood in her small room and prepared herself with the calm focus of ritual. She removed her formal uniform and replaced it with a close-fitting combat suit of dark material that would blend with shadows. Her twin blades came next, and she drew them from their sheaths to inspect the edges one final time. Blades were family heirlooms passed down through 4 generations of Dawson soldiers, and each one was perfectly balanced and razor-sharp. Other species dismissed them as primitive decorations meant for ceremony rather than combat. But Claire knew better. She had trained with these weapons since she was 6 years old, and they had become extensions of her own body. After sheathing the blades at her hips, she pulled her dark hair back into a tight knot that would not obstruct her vision. Then she turned off the lights in her quarters and slipped into the corridor outside. Station's maintenance tunnels ran throughout the structure like veins in a living body, and Claire had memorized their layout during her explorations the night before. She moved through them now in complete silence, her soft boots making no sound on the metal floors. Ambassador Marshall's quarters were located in the diplomatic wing on the station's 3rd level, and Claire positioned herself in a junction point that gave her sightlines to both main approaches. Then she waited in the darkness and let her breathing slow until she was almost perfectly still. Time passed slowly in the shadows, and Claire used it to center her mind and prepare for what was coming. She thought about her training under Commander Holt, about the countless hours of practice that had shaped her body into a weapon. She thought about her family back on Earth, about her mother who had first taught her to hold a blade, and her father who had died in the first border conflict with the Vorak. She thought about all the people who had ever underestimated her because of her size, and how they had always learned their mistake too late. A soft sound reached her ears from the main corridor, barely audible but unmistakable to her trained senses. Heavy footsteps, carefully placed but still too loud for human movement. The Vorak assassins were coming. Claire pressed herself deeper into the shadows and watched 3 massive figures emerge from the darkness ahead. They wore no armor tonight, only dark clothing that covered their scales, and each one carried a long curved blade designed for silent killing. They moved with surprising stealth for creatures their size. But Claire could see them clearly with her dark adapted eyes. The lead assassin reached Ambassador Marshall's door and produced a device that began bypassing the security lock. The other two stood guard, their eyes scanning the corridor but passing over Claire's hiding spot. Without seeing her, she drew her blades in one fluid motion and stepped out of the shadows. The first assassin died before he knew she was there. Claire's blade sliced through the gap between his neck plates where the scales were thinnest, and dark blood sprayed across the corridor wall as he collapsed without a sound. The second assassin turned at the soft thump of his comrade's body hitting the floor, and his yellow eyes widened in shock as he saw the tiny human standing over the corpse. He raised his plasma rifle and fired. But Claire was already moving. She dropped low and rolled beneath the energy blast. Coming up inside his guard, where his weapon was useless, her blade drove upward through his chest, finding the gap in his ribs with surgical precision, and he fell beside his brother with a gurgling wheeze. The third assassin was faster and smarter than the others. He threw his rifle aside and lunged forward with his killing blade, forcing Claire to leap backward to avoid the strike. "Tiny insect," he hissed, his voice filled with rage rather than mockery now. "You will die screaming for this." Claire said nothing and circled to her left, watching his movements and looking for an opening. The assassin was good, better than the others, and he used his reach advantage to keep her at a distance while probing her defenses. With quick thrusts and slashes, she blocked and dodged, retreating slowly while she studied his patterns. He grew confident as he pushed her back, and that confidence made him careless. He overextended on a powerful downward strike, and Claire sidestepped at the last instant. Her blade cut across his forearm, and he roared in pain as dark blood ran down his scales, but he recovered quickly and caught her with a backhand blow that sent her crashing into the wall. Stars exploded across her vision as her head struck the metal surface, and she barely managed to roll aside as his blade stabbed down at where she had fallen. He grabbed her by the throat before she could regain her feet, his massive hand closing around her neck and lifting her off the ground. "Foolish human," he laughed, squeezing tighter until she could barely breathe. "Did you really think you could defeat us with those little toys?" Claire could not speak, but she did not need words. She drove both blades through his wrists. With every ounce of strength she possessed, the assassin screamed and released her as his hands went limp from severed tendons and damaged nerves. Claire hit the ground and immediately surged upward, driving one blade through his heart. Before he could react, he stared down at her with disbelief in his yellow eyes. And then he fell like a great tree finally cut down. Claire stood in the corridor surrounded by 3 dead Vorak soldiers, her chest heaving as she fought to catch her breath. Her throat burned where the assassin had choked her, and her head throbbed from the impact with the wall. But she was alive. The door to Ambassador Marshall's quarters slid open, and the ambassador emerged in his sleeping clothes with wide, frightened eyes. "Lieutenant Dawson?" he gasped, staring at the carnage around her. "What happened here?" Claire sheathed her blades and stood at attention despite her injuries. "An assassination attempt, Ambassador," she reported, her voice rough from the damage to her throat. 3 Vorak operatives now neutralized. Marshall looked at the massive corpses and then back at his small guardian, and something like awe crossed his face. "You did this?" he asked quietly. "Alone?" Before Claire could answer, alarms began blaring throughout the station and running. Footsteps echoed from multiple directions. Station security arrived within minutes, followed by Commander Holt and representatives from several council species. The evidence was undeniable, and scanner records showed the 3 dead Vorak approaching the ambassador's quarters with weapons drawn. But Claire knew this was not over. General Voran would not accept defeat quietly, And whatever came next would be far more dangerous than 3 assassins in the dark. She stood beside Ambassador Marshall and waited for the storm she knew was coming. The council chamber erupted into chaos the moment General Voran arrived the next morning and saw the evidence. A raid against his people's station security had preserved the scene outside Ambassador Marshall's quarters, and recordings from multiple sensors showed the 3 Vorak assassins approaching with weapons drawn, but Voran refused to accept what the evidence clearly showed. "This is an outrage and a fabrication," he roared, his voice shaking the chamber walls. "Those soldiers acted without my knowledge or orders, and this human murderer slaughtered them while they were on a simple patrol." The Chelrix delegate clicked her mandibles in what might have been disbelief. "General, the evidence is quite clear," she said through her translator device. "Your soldiers were carrying assassination weapons and bypassing security locks on the ambassador's door." Voran slammed his fist on the podium before him. "I do not care what your evidence shows," he snarled. 3 of my finest warriors are dead, killed by that tiny creature, and I demand justice." He pointed one clawed finger directly at Claire, who stood at attention beside Commander Holt. "I demand that Human be handed over to face Vorak punishment for murder," he continued. "And I demand Ambassador Marshall apologize publicly for his species' treachery." Ambassador Marshall stepped forward with remarkable composure, given the accusations being thrown at him. "General Voran, your soldiers attempted to assassinate me in my sleep," he said calmly. "Lieutenant Dawson acted in my defense, which is her duty and her right under galactic law." The council chamber buzzed with whispered conversations as representatives from 12 species debated among themselves. Claire could see that some believed the evidence while others seemed afraid to anger the Varak Empire. This was the moment of greatest danger, and she knew that politics might still doom them despite the truth being on their side. General Voran smiled suddenly, a predatory expression that made Claire's instincts scream warnings. "Very well," he said in a tone that was suddenly calm and controlled. "If the council will not deliver justice through its laws, then I invoke the right of vindication." A shocked silence fell over the chamber. The Elowary representative's skin flashed through several colors rapidly, indicating extreme surprise. "General, the right of vindication has not been invoked in over 300 years," the Mondari delegate said from within her water suit. "Are you certain you wish to pursue this path?" Voran nodded slowly, his yellow eyes fixed on Claire. "I am certain," he said. "Ancient galactic law permits any party who feels wrong to demand trial by combat when other forms of justice fail." He raised his voice so everyone in the chamber could hear clearly. "I challenge the human called Claire Dawson to single combat in the arena," he announced. "If she refuses, humanity admits guilt and must surrender Ambassador Marshall to Vorak justice. And if she accepts and loses, the result is the same. But if she somehow wins, the Vorak will withdraw all accusations and leave this summit in peace." Commander Holt stepped forward with anger blazing in his eyes. "This is absurd," he protested. "You are twice her size and a trained warrior with decades of experience." Voran laughed, a deep rumbling sound filled with cruel amusement. "Then perhaps she should have thought of that before she murdered my soldiers," he replied. "The choice is hers, and she has until the next cycle to decide." The council adjourned in disorder, and Claire found herself surrounded by worried human delegates. As soon as they reached their quarters, Commander Holt paced back and forth while Ambassador Marshall sat with his head in his hands. "You cannot accept this challenge," Holt said firmly. "Voran is one of the deadliest warriors in the Varak Empire, and he has killed hundreds of opponents in single combat." Claire stood by the window and looked out at the stars. "If I refuse, Ambassador Marshall faces Vorak justice," she said quietly. "We both know what that means." Marshall looked up with guilt in his eyes. "Lieutenant, I cannot ask you to die for me," he said. Claire turned to face them both. "You are not asking," she replied simply. "I am choosing." She walked toward the door. "I have 1 day to prepare," she said over her shoulder. "I suggest we use it wisely." The next several hours were spent in intense preparation. Commander Holt reviewed every recording he could find of Vorak combat techniques, and together they analyzed Varen's fighting style. The Vorak favored overwhelming strength and reach, using massive war axes designed to crush opponents with single blows. They relied on their armored scales for defense and their size to intimidate enemies into making mistakes. "You cannot match his strength or his reach," Holt said grimly. "Your only advantages are speed and precision." Claire nodded as she stretched and prepared her body for the coming fight. "Then I will use what I have," she said late that night. A quiet knock came at her door. Claire opened it to find Kira Voss standing in the corridor, looking nervous and determined. "May I enter?" Kira asked softly. Claire stepped aside and let her in. "I should not be here," Kira said once the door closed behind her. "If Voran discovers I helped you, he will have me executed." "Then why are you here?" Claire asked. Kira's yellow eyes met hers with something like respect. "Because you showed mercy to my people once already," she said. "You could have killed those assassins quietly and hidden the evidence. But instead, you let the truth be seen." She reached into her clothing and produced a small data chip. "Varan has a weakness," she said. "An old wound on his left side beneath his ceremonial armor that never fully healed. And if you can strike there, you will cause him great pain and slow his movements." Claire took the chip and studied it for a moment before looking back at Kira. "Why do you want your own general to lose?" she asked. Kira's scales shifted color with emotion. "Because Varan represents everything wrong with our empire," she said fiercely. "He wants endless war and conquest while millions of Varak die for his glory. And there are many of us who believe peace is possible if his faction loses power." She moved toward the door. "Win tomorrow, Claire Dawson," she said. "Win and show the galaxy that strength is not the only thing that matters." Then she was gone. Claire spent the remaining hours meditating and preparing her mind for what was to come when dawn arrived. She dressed in her combat suit and strapped her twin blades to her hips. Commander Holt met her outside her quarters with worry etched deep into his weathered face. "Are you ready?" he asked. Claire looked at him and felt a strange calm settling over her. "My blades never miss." "Commander," she said quietly, "that is not arrogance. And it is simply the truth." Together they walked toward the arena where 12 species waited to see if one small human could defeat a giant. The arena at the heart of Concordia Prime was a vast circular space designed for exactly this kind of ancient ritual. And today, it was filled with thousands of spectators from every corner of the galaxy. Representatives from 12 species filled the tiered seating that rose around the fighting floor, and billions more watched through broadcast feeds that carried the signal to distant worlds. The fate of 2 civilizations would be decided in this place before this day ended. General Thrax Voron entered first, and the Varak soldiers in attendance roared their approval with thunderous voices. He wore his ceremonial armor decorated with bones and teeth, and he carried his great war axe in both hands like it weighed nothing at all. The weapon was enormous, with a blade wider than Claire's entire body, and it had ended hundreds of lives throughout Voron's long career. He strode to the center of the arena and raised his axe above his head while his people chanted his name. Then the human entrance opened, and Claire walked out alone. She wore no armor, only her dark combat suit that left her arms free for movement. Her twin blades hung at her hips, looking impossibly small compared to the massive weapon her opponent carried. A strange silence fell over the Varak section as they watched this tiny creature approached their champion, some laughed nervously, while others simply stared in disbelief. Voron lowered his axe and smiled with predatory anticipation. So, the little human decided to come after all, he said loudly enough for the crowd to hear. I thought perhaps you would flee during the night and spare yourself this humiliation. Claire stopped 10 paces from him and drew her blades in one smooth motion. She said nothing in response, and her silence seemed to unsettle Voron more than any words could have. No last words? He taunted. No brave speech about human courage or determination. Claire simply raised her blades into a ready position and waited. The arena official, an elderly Chelrix with ceremonial robes, stepped forward and raised one limb. This combat will continue until one party yields, is unable to continue, or is killed, she announced. May the truth be revealed through this contest. She brought her limb down sharply. Begin. Voron charged immediately, covering the distance between them with terrifying speed. For a creature his size, his axe swung in a devastating horizontal arc that would have cut Claire in half if it had connected, but she was no longer there. Claire moved like water flowing around a stone, dropping low and sliding beneath the blade's path with inches to spare as she passed Voron's side. Her blade flicked out and scored a thin cut across his forearm. First blood to the human. Voron roared in surprise and spun, bringing his axe down in a crushing overhead strike. Claire danced backward, and the weapon cratered the arena floor where she had stood a heartbeat earlier. He pressed forward with a series of powerful blows, each one capable of ending the fight instantly if it landed. But Claire never tried to block or meet his strength with her own. She simply flowed around every attack like smoke through fingers. And each time she passed close, her blades left small wounds on his scales. The crowd grew quieter with each exchange as they watched something they had never seen before. A Varic general, one of the most feared warriors in the galaxy, was bleeding from a dozen small cuts while his tiny opponent remained. Unto Chet Voron's attacks grew wilder as frustration and rage clouded his judgment. He swung his axe in broad sweeping arcs that left him exposed for precious seconds. Claire exploited every opening, her blades finding the gaps in his armor with surgical precision. Stand still and fight me, Voron bellowed, his voice cracking with fury. Stop running like a coward. Claire remained silent and continued her deadly dance. She could see the weakness Kira had told her about now. A slight favoring of his left side where old scar tissue pulled at his movements. She began targeting that area specifically, and each strike made him flinch and slow. Just a little more, the gallery was completely silent. Now Varic soldiers watched with horror as their champions stumbled and bled. Representatives from other species leaned forward with wide eyes, witnessing something that would be spoken of for generations. Voron made one final desperate lunge, putting all his remaining strength into a strike meant to end the fight through sheer, overwhelming force. Claire saw it coming from the moment he shifted his weight. She feinted left, drawing his guard in that direction, and then spun right with perfect grace. Her blade drove deep into the weak point on his left side, exactly where Kira had said the old wound lay hidden. Voron screamed, a sound of agony that echoed through the arena like thunder. His axe clattered from his grip as his legs buckled, and he fell to his knees before the tiny human he had mocked so many times. Claire stood before him with her blade at his throat, and the arena held its breath. One thrust would end his life and avenge every insult he had ever spoken. Voron looked up at her with something new in his yellow eyes, something that might have been fear or might have been respect. Finish it then, he growled through clenched teeth. Kill me and claim your victory. Claire held her position for a long moment while the galaxy watched. Then she stepped back and sheathed her blades. The duel is finished, she announced, her voice carrying clearly through the silent arena. I have won, and I choose to show mercy. A gasp ran through the crowd from species who had never expected such an outcome. The Chelrix official stepped forward and raised her limb. "The human is victorious," she declared. "By the ancient laws, the Vorak must withdraw their accusations and depart this summit in peace." Vorak soldiers rushed forward to collect their fallen general, carrying him from the arena without meeting anyone's eyes. Claire watched them go and felt the weight of the moment settling over her. She had done more than win a fight. Today she had shown the galaxy that humanity could be both strong and merciful. Both fierce and compassionate. Commander Holt reached her first, his weathered face showing pride and relief in equal measure. "That was the most incredible thing I have ever witnessed," he said quietly. Ambassador Marshall approached next, tears glistening in his eyes. "Lieutenant Dawson, I do not have words to thank you properly," he said. Claire shook her head slightly. "I was just doing my duty." "Ambassador," she replied as they walked from the arena together. Claire saw Kira Voss watching from a distance. The Vorak translator nodded once with gratitude and respect in her yellow eyes. "Stories of this day will spread through our empire," Kira had said. And Claire believed it was true. Perhaps those stories would help more. Vorak believed that peace with humanity was possible. Perhaps her mercy today would save more lives than her blades ever could. Commander Holt walked beside her as they left the arena. "Behind, Lieutenant," he said after a long silence. "Did you ever doubt you could win?" Claire looked up at the stars visible through the station's great windows and felt a small smile cross her face. "My blades never miss." "Commander," she said quietly, "that is not arrogance." She touched the hilts of the weapons that had been in her family for 4 generations. "It is simply the truth.